Welcome to the Voices of Impact podcast, where we engage in spirited discourse on the world's most pressing issues with the goal to discover and implement solutions. We are an ambitious youth group, and we will not settle until we have tackled every challenge our world faces.
Previous generations have left us with a host of issues, but the world is ours. Join us as we learn life lessons and how to contribute to a more fair and uplifting planet. We will take the torch from older generations, learning from their mistakes.
We will glean wisdom from the experiences of adults who tried to prevent us from ending up with the issues that we face today, as well as the experiences of adults who, to this day, stand alongside us, fighting the southward progression of many spiraling dilemmas.
Tune in weekly as we approach these many quadrants through the lens of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, for the planet. Voices of Impact is brought to you by the University of San Diego's Jacobs Institute for Innovation and Education, PPC Profit Pros, and Schoolcast, a Cloudcast media program to empower the voices of young students around the world.
Hello everyone, we're back with another episode of Voices of Impact. The United Nations, or UN, has 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, for a brighter future. In this podcast series, we will have discussions on 12 of the SDGs chosen by our World Council of Youth. Today, for episode 12, the Council has led us to cover Partnership for the Goals. We will discuss its issues and solutions alike while adding our own thoughts from our research. I'm Isabella.
I'm Shane.
I'm Kenneth, and this is Voices of Impact.
I'm so happy to be back since our last episode.
We've gone through all these things from water to sanitation, and all these things that we've been talking about. Feel that we've really been learning a lot from our guests. So I wanted to introduce we're lucky to have two amazing guests today. So first, we have Dr. Roberto Leon. He is a well-known civil engineer who is currently a professor at Virginia Tech. And we have Ashley Ahrens-Víquez, who is a co-project manager at the impactful Jacobs Institute for Innovation and Education. And to start this conversation, we need to break down the big goals of Partnership for the Goals into three main things. And the three main things that we want to talk about is research mobilization, inclusivity in partnerships, and accountability and transparency.
Absolutely. Those are all very important topics that we got to get to today. But before we do, I want to just really quickly have some fun with the guests and ask each of you what got you started on your paths through academia and empowerment of various groups.
Start with Dr. Leon first.
Okay, so I have had the privilege of moving around the world, even as a very young child. I left Costa Rica, where I was born, when I was 5. Then I lived for about 7 years in Peru in South America. And then I moved to Italy and spent another 7 years or so there before I came to the US. And I have had the travel bug forever. I think I've been to probably around 60 different countries now. And so I've seen a lot of the world. And when I lived in Peru, I was really impressed by diversity. Having lived in Costa Rica is very tropical, but in Peru, you go from the coast, which is desertic, truly desertic, to the highlands of the Andes, and then on the other side, the Amazonia. And it's just amazing to be able to see the world and experience different cultures. So I come from the civil engineering side, and I think today I'm going to speak mostly from the issues of infrastructure and inequalities in access to infrastructure and topics of that type.
I love it. Even in terms of civil engineering, I have tremendous respect for your work in understanding structures and the various buildings that create our modern infrastructure. I just wanted to share real quick. I read by J.E. Gordon Structures, or Why Things Don't Fall Down.
Yeah.
Very good book. Have you read it?
Yes, actually, I have read many of those books because I teach a class now in what is called forensic engineering. So we look at how to learn from failures, but also very much how to mitigate potential failures and what we can do to improve our infrastructure. Because realistically, if you look at the data, for about every dollar that we invest in infrastructure mitigation, we collect about $10 to $12 in losses that don't occur. And so one of my mantras about all of this is that as a designer, you can spend maybe 2-3% more at the very beginning of a project, and you get so much more at the other end. And so sustainability and I would say what we call robustness, or perhaps good performance, is something that doesn't need to cost a lot of money.
In my physics class, I saw a bridge that was designed perhaps not that well. It was engaging in simple harmonic motion. So it was like a piece of jello. It's important to get your math right when you're building a bridge that millions of people drive over. What about you, Miss Ahrens? What got you started in your journey?
So, funnily enough, Dr. Roberto and I both share roots in Costa Rica. My family is from there, specifically my mother, but I grew up here in San Diego. I grew up in the San Diego Tijuana region. So I've lived my whole life in kind of a porous manner, living through, a Latino household while also getting American education and, balancing both elements of my identity. I went into college, always been very interested in politics, in international dialogue and relations between different countries. And I actually started my research on Europe and just about European institutions. But as I spent more time reflecting, I realized that my background, my passions lied more in Latin America. So I spent my last 2 years of college, and then 7 years after I graduated, working in Latin America. So I got my start in Justice in Mexico, in which we provided capacity building efforts. And now my career has led me to the Jacobs Institute for Innovation and Education, and I'm continuing the efforts of capacity building. I'm really interested in putting, policy recommendations that are given in research into action. It's one thing to, list 5 different things, but to take that step and actually providing support and policy support is so important to me. And I'm so glad to participate in different projects that are able to make those things happen.
So you're giving back to your roots, and were you involved in the Impactful Sandbox, which gave our team our start?
I was not. I actually joined the Pactful team in November, so I'm still very new. But currently, we're working on our Jacobs Teen Innovation Challenge, which you probably know a little bit about. But essentially, we're providing skills, design thinking, innovation, and the design thinking process to students throughout the world, and we're grounding that in the 17 sustainable development goals. So we're collaborating with folks from over 24 different countries. It's been a real privilege, but the sandbox is a continuation of that goal to bring design thinking to students and to help them communicate what their ideas are.
So, Miss Ahrens-Víquez, I wanted to get into our first point of resource mobilization. And have you had any experiences, like either in Mexico or working here in San Diego, where there's a lack of resources that need to be going to the people that actually need them? And how do you say that? What were some of the things that helped you bridge those gaps to get the people the things that they need?
So a lot of my work, as I mentioned, is kind of based in capacity building. So much of the resources I've been, directly engaging with, or lack thereof, really has to do with lack of knowledge, training, you know, the things that make creating projects possible. So the projects I've been working on really give people the skill set, the language for which to communicate what their needs are. Some of my professional experience I mentioned was in Mexico. We observed that, Mexico went from a written legal system to an oral litigation system, much closer to ours. So, you know, what you think of in a trial are, you know, judges, you have your opening statements, your interrogations, your closing statements. And we were finding that, you know, the knowledge just wasn't there. It was a brand new effort in Mexico. And what was really needed was the resources and the knowledge to actually put that into practice. So yeah, we noticed that universities just didn't have the resources to provide the training. Even something as simple as like prosecution's offices weren't able to properly transition into the new system super readily. It's an ongoing process, really, and yeah, there's a bunch of literature on it as well. But I think the core of my work has been giving people the ability to, you know, help themselves and to, you know, benefit from the knowledge of other folks.
So are you saying the legal system in Mexico is developing to become more like ours with trials and court?
Yeah, the change happened in 2008 and it was set to be fully implemented in 2016. So, yes, like it is now more similar to the US's system. However, there are some very big differences, of course. For instance, there are no juries. There's usually a single judge making all the rulings, or a panel of 3 judges, depending on the criminal case. But yeah, essentially they're kind of moving closer to the US's system.
I find that very interesting. And if you don't mind, I'd like to expand on that, because I was reading this book, The Tools of Argument: How the Best Lawyers Think, Argue, and Win. And it talks about how a lawyer's job is really to apply precedent to a case. What
Mhm.
what case happened in the past that we can take precedent from? How do you actually do that when you're starting out in 2008 with this legal system? And do you think there's a lack of justice, or what do you think about just even expanding this, the legal systems in other countries, and how do we actually develop them from the ground zero level?
Hmm. I mean, there were already a lot of efforts into doing this. Back in 2008, there were obviously folks that were studying abroad that kind of had the knowledge of how other systems worked. Um, I, as far as like the capacity building, I'm really not sure how it started. I mean, they really just like launched themselves into the process. It was it was like a huge experiment. Um,
But they
yeah,
used experts from other places, which kind of ties into partnership for the goals, right?
exactly.
Equity and justice being a theme of the SDGs, and partnership for the goals discusses how we need experts from other places that are perhaps more developed in a domain of human knowledge, like the legal system, to influence development.
Yeah, correct. We brought experts from, or like folks that were very experienced in the legal field from the US, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador. Chile and Colombia also went through a very similar process, to varying degrees of um, success. But it was really important for us to provide folks that had a similar experience of developing the legal system. You were talking about, you know, lack of justice, and I I don't think of it so much my place to, you know, prescribe much to other legal systems that I don't necessarily have a ton of knowledge about. Um, but I think that this was their effort to really strengthen and address the 98% impunity that exists in the country. Um, so, I mean, we're still figuring out what those results are going to be. It's going to be a multi-generational process. We kind of have a parallel in the U.S. as well, going from the it stemming from mob violence and gangs in New York in the 60s. The US has gone through a massive overhaul as well, and we're only starting to see what those results are now. So I don't expect to see results for many years.
I just wanted to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more. I was actually born in Colombia and I lived in Chile for like 4 years. So I kind of know kind of like their systems and you know how like the rules and like the laws and like the schools and like kind of like their institutions. And I've been to like the universities because I lived in Santiago, the capital. So it's kind of like, you know, the center of everything. And I think you're right. I think our countries are like, most of South America is like kind of like still developing their way of doing things. And they're certainly getting inspired by how other nations are doing it. So, you know, I wanted to ask you, how do you think maybe other wealthier nations can play, like what role can they play in supporting those that have fewer resources?
I think this is a really interesting topic because then you're getting into like the relationship between kind of like what you would call the global north and the global south and the way that they intersect. I feel like it's very important to listen to those in the global south and, you know, address what they're asking for rather than members of the global north kind of prescribing and saying that like this is what one should do. We've seen, you know, very interesting results from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank when it comes to, you know, balancing budgets and cutting social spending. So I think it's the onus is on wealthier countries with more resources to listen to the requests and the needs of the global south rather than telling them what they need to do.
What about you, Mr. Roberto Leon? I'm sure that you've had a lot of experience and have seen different point of views as you've traveled a lot. What do you think is the most important or like similarities or differences between the nations?
I think we lost connection to him, so we'll just wait for him to be back. But before we wait, but while he's still gone, Miss Ashley, I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about how it's important for the global north to focus on the global south. And instead of saying, oh, this is how much you guys need, like really listening to what the global south. And my question for that is, there's the problem with corruption that's we've dealt with corruption a lot. So how would you say that we control it so that the South can't just say, oh, we need more money, 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 because of the corruption. They just want more money, right? And kind of make sure there's like a balance between that.
I think this has to do a lot with the concepts of transparency. And I, from my experience, I know that like federal grants, for instance, require a lot of oversight and have a lot of like high barriers to entry. You have to do a lot of grant reporting and such. And I feel that the reporting aspect is really important. You want to make sure that you are getting very detailed budgets, detailed reports on what things are getting spent on. And like the element of corruption is important to take into account, especially when, you know, administering resources, especially when it comes to like hard goods or hard, you know, things like water, food, just funds in general. Um, I yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
And then I've learned a lot about just talking with you that there's a lot of problems with like legality systems, and we got to make sure that there's a level of transparency. So, Roberto Leon, I wanted to ask you about how, with your expertise in structural engineering, is there like a specific way that we can push for other countries to make sure that there's transparencies in their reporting so we're we feel safe sending them the amount of money that they need and make sure that they get the right amount of money.
Well, actually, I was going to start talking a little bit about the long view because that's something Ashley brought up, and I was just going to mention that in the way I work a lot with building codes and just trying to make things safer, better, and so on and so forth. And so in the United States right now, we're looking at what we call smart construction. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because there's tremendous inequality, even inside the United States, in housing and similar things. And so, we try to do the best as engineers and as scientists to create better ways of building. And then we try to transmit that to Latin America. I've been to many countries giving talks. We collaborate extensively with them in developing building codes. But there is another level from which these countries have to take what we give them and then apply it to their own circumstances, to what they can afford to do, because we can't afford to build the same way in, let's say, in Colombia that we do in the United States. And so one of the things that's important is that these changes take a very long time. If you think about how many buildings we have and how many new buildings we're putting together, the old buildings are probably not very good, and it's going to take a long time to replace those. And so I think that resources are very important, but I think that we need to pay more attention, for example, as to how to build with local materials and how to actually research that. For example, in tropical countries, you can use bamboo and things like that. And so we don't necessarily have to transfer what we have from more or less the developed world there. We have to be very careful about how we do that. I will say that I'm very attuned to the issue of inequality, having lived in Peru. When I went to Peru, that was a very, very unequal country. It still is that way, probably not as bad, but the level of services or housing that we have around the world is very diverse. And I would like to take my professorial point of view and ask the students, if you think about when you're going to be working hard, let's say 2050, which do you think are going to be the largest cities in the world where you're going to need to be paying attention to infrastructure? Any ideas from you guys?
Parts of China, maybe.
Okay.
Since they're going back on their one child thing and they're trying to get people to have more children. Silicon Valley, I think it might continue to be a tech hub.
I was thinking maybe more of maybe like Europe, maybe parts that are maybe not as big right now, but will evolve into those big cities that we know today.
I think for me, I'm going to take a little quirky approach, and I think we're going to have to focus more on the biggest places that we have to focus on are not like the big cities right now, because I'm assuming they have like the necessities, they have like regular bills, they can live with that. But in areas where they don't have the resources, or you were talking about the local resources, they don't have the money. I feel like if there is a moment where we find something new or innovative that we can implement there, since the bar is so low there, then that can be translated everywhere. Hopefully in the next 25 years, 20, 25 years, a city like that appears and I think that would be like the ideal scenario where we can implement the changes there where they didn't have as much resources and bring that to cities that have more resources and will be able to kind of cut back on a lot of problems.
Kenneth, I agree with you, and but my question was to the fact that most likely the largest city in the world in 2050 is probably going to be Kinshasa in the Republic of Congo. And the second one might be Lagos, Nigeria, and the third one, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and so on. And these are going to be enormous cities, much bigger than the ones we have today. Places like Mexico City and Sao Paulo and Beijing and all of those, Tokyo, all of those are going to continue to grow, but they're going to be overtaken by cities in developing countries, if you want to call it that way, or emergent countries. And the real question in terms of resources is where are we going to find the resources to create those megacities? And the answer is, if we keep doing things we're doing right now, that's not the answer. We need substantial innovations. When I started working as a researcher back 40 years ago, my goal was, by the time I retire, we are not building steel and concrete. We have found a new material to build. And so I think if I were to restart my career today, I would restart it as a material scientist, because I think we really need some breakthroughs, some real innovations, what is sometimes called disruptive technologies, to be able to handle what is coming, because it is going to be very tough to deal with very large numbers of people who are wanting to live in cities, because that's where most of them want to go. And how are we going to build the water treatment plants? How are we going to provide electricity? How are we going to build transportation systems for them, housing, and so on? That's, I think, where we really need innovation, and we need to be thinking really outside the box. So I'm very pleased that you guys are thinking about it, but I think that you don't need to follow people like me anymore. We've done our thing, and we are old and out of step. So you guys need to go and do your own thing.
So when we're trying to help the global South develop, how do we avoid enforcing our ways on them and doing it in a way that is respectful to their traditions? Like, for example, in the Scramble for Africa, this idea of the white man's burden to educate the lesser men who were, considered underdeveloped and less than. How do we avoid that and have respect for other cultures while helping them?
Well, from my standpoint, we can learn a lot from them. They have been living in that environment for a very long time. They have survived. They understand their environment. Okay, and so I don't think that it's very fruitful to try to impose or even transfer directly technologies from the developed world. Our technologies are so energy intensive that they're not going to work. And so, again, my thinking is, for example, I had a colleague who was investigating how ants in Africa build these enormous termite mounds, and what is the material that they make naturally. And it turns out to be a very strong and very useful material. Now, how do we can't have termites build things for us, right? How do we, in the developed world, for example, look at the chemistry of what's going on there on those materials and be able to reproduce it? I have no idea how to do that. There are colleagues of mine here who are interested in that topic, and so I would say respect for the local knowledge is important, and then a much broader approach, a much more multidisciplinary approach to these issues. Traditionally, yeah.
And who knows? Maybe the global South will have some of their own ideas. Maybe they'll be able to do it better than us. At least in the case of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. look at that. What is this? You know? So we don't have everything figured out here either. But this might start a global collaboration.
Mhm.
I wanted to echo that sentiment, talking about innovation coming from the global south. So a lot of the work that we do with Pactful is essentially giving young folks, so we work primarily with adolescents, the tools to develop innovation. So the design thinking process is based in engineering and can be applied in different like STEM disciplines. However, the design thinking process is not limited to just STEM. It can be applied in all sorts of ways. So, just as an overview, the design thinking process starts with understanding. So, understanding a problem, creating or doing research, conducting interviews like you are now, and creating empathy is the most important thing in the understanding phase. You want to make sure that you have context, knowledge of whatever problem you want to unpack and solve. And you have like the history and knowledge to then kind of develop whatever project or solve whatever problem you want. Then you would go into like an ideating phase where you come up with big solutions, narrow it down to things that are achievable and kind of more specific. Then you would move on to the prototyping phase where you create something, try to get some feedback, redo it over and over and over again, and then pitching and communicating your idea. So that's the design thinking mindset in a nutshell. But our hope by bringing these skills to not only schools here in San Diego, but wherever we can is so important. This year we have a huge showing from Nigeria specifically, and your comment, Dr. Roberto, about Lagos potentially being one of the next huge hubs of the world makes me feel really excited, because I want to make sure the students there have tools to solve their problems and use the resources that they have around them, base it on their own experiences, their own communities, and then maybe as a next step, bringing that to a global forum and then creating conversation, because that's how things get done.
You mentioned that empathy was like a big part of the design thinking process. How do you think we can spread or, maybe make people more aware that empathy is a big part? How can we make it a big part of innovation? How can we express the idea that's a really important fact of, evolving?
Listening is such an important exercise, and I'm so glad that we're here today with students that want to talk to people and want to listen. Um, Speaking a little less, trying to be a little less prescriptive, and just listening to folks is so important. Whenever one is trying to develop something or help support a particular community, it is way more important for you to listen to what they need than for you to go in and say, this is what you need.
So,
I
Dr.
will.
Sorry, what were you saying? So my question for you, Dr. Roberto Leon, is you're talking about like these three cities being like the biggest cities. And when you said those cities, that was not what I had in mind at all, if I'm gonna be totally honest with you. So why? I think
Where did
that's
you
what
get that?
Well, I mean, it is just where population is growing, right? And even like, Africa has enormous natural resources that we have been draining for years. And, you want to look at the diamond trade or, the similar things, right?
Mercantilism.
But I think going back to what Ashley was saying, I think, again, listening is extremely important. And I will go much further. English, or at least in my area, in science and technology, bad English is the universal language, and that is homogenizing discussions, and that is not necessarily good. I think we need to be able to hablar en español y decir las cosas como son y no necesariamente asumir che todo il mondo entiende. And
Sì,
so, e posso anche dirlo in italiano, ma l'italiano non va. Eh, but I think it's important that young people understand that, and understand culture. So much of what I have in my background is Western art and Western music, for example, and I love both of them. I go to places like Japan or China that have even older traditions. And I must say, I have an appreciation for what it is, but I don't sort of sense it the way I would if I could speak Chinese or Japanese. Okay. And so language skills, I still think are very, very important, because the vast majority of the people cannot communicate with you in English in a accurate way.
You were saying that, culture is really important, right? And I think, most students right now, or at least the society that I know, my school, they're like, oh, you know what? I'm just gonna learn Spanish because it's the language that just like the second most basic language that most people know. But I don't really think they're appreciating, because, most schools just have okay, English, normal English class, Spanish. That's it. But they don't have Japanese, for example, or French, or other languages that might be the most popular language in the future. We don't know that. So I think it's also important spread diversity, because you never know who's gonna make it big, or you never know what the future holds.
I love how some European schools teach students many different languages. Like in elementary school, I tried to learn Mandarin. I didn't really get very far, but I wish it was a more integrated part of education to just learn even 3 languages, and in some cases more, because language learning is very beneficial for your brain, and it helps you in many unrelated ways by strengthening your brain at a young age.
I really like this connection with art that you mentioned as well. I think that art is such an important thing and an important way of communicating culture, because we're limited. I mean, the language is so important, like, do not get me wrong, but language is also very limiting. There's certain things that you can convey in one language and not the other. And it's really important for us to develop understanding between cultures. And I think the most important way of doing that is art.
Very true.
I'll agree with that. I think that there are many things that we can learn through languages. But again, going back to your point, I think it's extremely important that you learn it young. I picked up English at the edge of that era where your brain is still kind of attuned to that. And that's maybe 12, 13 years old. And so what I'm talking about is that I have the privilege of, for example, of reading Latin American literature in Spanish, and then trying to read the best translation in English, and it just doesn't go. It's just, I mean, I can appreciate it, but it just doesn't make the same impact. And the opposite is also true, right? I mean, I can read Shakespeare, but it's not the same thing. And so I think culture as a whole is really important. And so before we go into Africa, for example, we need to understand what they want, right? And even the elites in Africa are probably not the people we need to ask.
So just more getting a general consensus. Yeah, I mean, and that plays into the cultural thing, because culture is not just about the elites, but it's about everyone. I mean, I was trying to, I was interviewing my grandmother, who's traveled the world. She's been to an insane number of countries, like 30, or I think a lot more than that actually. I'm trying to write a biography about her. She actually painted many paintings around the house, and they're inspired by African cultures and other cultures that she's seen. So it's important to have a worldview influenced by the art of various areas.
And the thing that I really like about language is I want to say that when you talk to someone else, like with a different language for the first time, or you like say the first Mexican guy I met, the first thing that I learned from him was the bad words. And it just has a different effect when I'm saying these words in Spanish and saying it in English. It has this sort of aggressiveness with this playfulness as well. So I think it's very important, like everyone has been saying, it's important to make sure that we know the language, because you could be doing everything the same, all the manners the same, but if the words don't come out right, then it's not right. So I want to move on to our last topic, which is accountability and transparency. We talked a little bit about this, but how can we just increase the level of transparency on all levels? And feel free to just talk about your own expertise and how you think where your work is being done, how we can, how transparency, if it is a solution for the problems that you guys are trying to solve.
I think transparency is important because it buys you confidence and respect. Um, on the other hand, in the area that I work on, which is construction, the history is very checkered on that, and there's always been a large amount of corruption associated with these companies, be there in developed countries or underdeveloped countries. And if you're interested, you can go and read the case of a very large Brazilian construction company that dominated Latin America called Odebrecht. And they got a lot accomplished, and they did great services for countries, but they were bribing people left and right. And you have to uh, assume, I think, that it comes with the territory to some degree. You can't have 100% complete transparency, but you can try to enforce it so that a lot of money does not get lost. And let me give you just one example from the developed country where there is a huge project called the Messina Straits Bridge that goes from the tip of the Buddha in Italy into Sicily. And it is a European project. I'm not going to even guess how many billions of euros that's going to cost. But upfront, it's accepted in a developed country in Europe that 50% of the money will probably not go directly into the construction itself. That's how much is going right off the top. Now,
That
you
is
know
a
that
lot
that's
of money.
and so I want to make sure that we understand that that's not an issue just in the South or in emergent societies. It's pervasive everywhere. And I mean, you look at a country like Russia right now. Yeah. Anyway, that's a little bit of politics. Transparency is important, but I think getting things done is probably more important.
And only
Um,
some of the money that is allocated for a particular purpose goes into that purpose, as is often the case with uh, government proceedings. Like in Poverty by America, a book that I read for our No Poverty episode, um, it discusses how only small fractions of the money that is allocated for various initiatives in poverty actually go there. So, and I guess what you're saying now is that building projects and infrastructure follow suit.
Yeah, again, I want to. We could talk about this for ages, but I think that the important thing for me is that we actually improve the lives of the people that are in poverty, which is an enormous number of people. people who don't, who are living day to day, even for their food. Um, to me, how we get there, I'm willing to accept some losses.
And
Put it
partnership
that way.
for the
It's a
goals.
moral compromise. I understand that,
Yeah.
and perhaps not what you want to hear a person say, but that's really the way things will get accomplished.
It's not 100% efficient, right? And partnership for the goals. On that note, it's not just like a partnership between countries. It's also a domestic partnership, like you were saying, to address poverty issues. And I would say it's also a partnership in within the communities. So at the community level, I'd like to open it up to everyone. How can we make a difference in poverty and in other goals? Just ourselves, not no assuming that the listeners and viewers are not fancy people in government. How can they make a difference in the SDGs?
If we're talking about social inequality and monetary inequality, I'm actually going to push back on that one. I think that normal everyday listeners need to be holding their leaders accountable. I think it's a big myth that, like, on an individual level, you can achieve a lot. You can make things change and perpetuate change in your life and your community. However, it's really large policies that play into systemic inequality and poverty. And it's really important that everyday people are looking at the policies at a governmental level really critically and use their voice to address those issues on a systemic level.
So communities can make a difference, but indirectly by proxy.
Yes, it really is about building community and listening to other people and banding together and using the consensus and the power of many voices to affect change.
So my question on that is, if we focus a lot on community, is there a risk of where we're trying to make these little band-aid solutions for the small communities that we have, and that in turn causes for there to be friction between the communities? Because I'm going to assume that one solution for a single community is not going to work for another community. So by us trying to focus too much on the small, I fear that the whole cohesion, and that might be a little bit too utopia like thinking that I'm trying to do, but how do we kind of prevent that, like, divide when we're trying to combine those communities together?
Ken, I think you're quite correct, because solutions are not at a single scale. Solutions are at multi scales. And so we can't expect that one of, working at the micro scale or the macro scale by themselves is going to help. One of the things that we are dealing with right now, at least in civil engineering, is just the degree of complexity of the systems that we have. I mean, all of the systems are intertwined. So let me give you just, if you have a storm and there's ice on the wires, on the electrical wires, and things, the towers collapse, who is going to be affected by that? The scales are very, very different, and what we call feedback loops between these different systems are very complicated, and so we don't even understand them very well for developed countries. And so each cult, and this is why I go back to culture. Each culture needs to set its priorities, decide how it's going to go about dealing with the problems. I think that it has to come from within, and it's always a combination of people from the bottom and getting the right leaders at the top.
Um, on that note, do you think that if we collaborate with other nations, it's not just us giving them advice on how they should run things, but also listening to how they run things and what works better for them, so that way we can also implement it in our societies?
Definitely, and that's the way it should be, because Up to now, it's mostly the developed world taking natural resources, converting them, and then sending them back in the form that we want them. So we don't recreate products thinking, oh, in Latin America this might be a better option, right? And so we need to start thinking about that.
Yeah, and this has a lot to do with empathy and, approaching others as equals. If you're going to have dialogue, that goes both ways. You want to be listening to the other and trying to take their advice as well. I totally just or agree with you there.
Also, talking about culture, how can we implement our culture into others or vice versa? Because I think that's also some things we're really struggling with, that we're not really communicating with each other and maybe expressing culture maybe verbally or through art. How do you think, or what's the best way to approach not just mixing, combining cultures, but learning cultures from one another?
I think, in my own opinion, like when we're looking at cultures and things like that, well, we have this like option of empathy, which we've talked a lot about, but I think it's also knowing about who you are yourself, because I would argue that a lot of individuals don't even know themselves really well, and they expect for everyone else to solve their own problems. So rather than not even culture, right? Just know who you are as an individual and how you interact with the things around you. That's what I would define culture as, rather than something that's been pushed down years after years of say, oh, this is my mom's culture. Why are we letting ourselves as individuals letting that dictate who we are and how we kind of perceive the world? And because the thing is, if we bring down those grudges year after year after year, it comes a time where, say, these two grandparents fought in like the 1800s, and then 200 years later the kids are still fighting over, and they have no idea it's their ancestors, but I do feel like something like that happens in the world. We see a lot of nations that have tensions with each other because of history. It's not because of present day problems. It's because the history of, oh, I used to own you guys. Oh, you're supposed to come into my country. But we have to be able to look at the present and saying, where can we evolve from here to make sure that we're leading individual lives for each and every one of us? Those are my thoughts to your question, Isabella.
It's a very good point, Kenneth. I'm half Dutch, and my Dutch family, talks about, not that they personally believe them, but there's this deep ingrained disdain for German people, and not. And like my Dutch family has lots of German friends, but they do always have to get past that and remember that it's irrational to have any kind of contention for the Germans, because they were different people, completely different people from the past who subjugated Dutch and others. So we need to get past this ancient contention, and not spark any new contention with Haitian people, for example, or Mexican immigrants, or other places in other communities in other parts of the world. We need to get past it and not start any more of it.
I think both things can exist at the same time. It's important to acknowledge that um, we exist in context. We're not in a vacuum. We're not just living with the present. We live in harmony with our political and historical pasts. And I think that the process of intergenerational healing and uh, moving on from that also involves engaging with the uncomfortable past and acknowledging it and uh, you know facing the discomfort. And I think all of those things can be true at the same time.
Right. I see your point, Miss Ahrens-Víquez. I think what I'm getting at even more is not like, of course, I have a lot of bad feelings for German people who uh, subjugated my family, my ancestors. But what I'm saying is that that should not in any way bear influence on how I see German people today. German people who are still alive who don't have those feelings, just like how I wouldn't expect. I would hope that people who the Dutch have subjugated in the past do not hate me for it, or do not have any kind of prejudice against my kind, because I'm not defined by my ancestors, and we are new stewards of the world, whose identities speak for themselves.
And something that I would like to ask Dr. Roberto Leon is we talked about like the history, and there's a lot of hate that comes from history. And I know your area of expertise is building codes. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming that building codes, they have to be very exact. They like each little thing has to be defined because I see very funny videos and it seems that we lost them, but there's a lot of OSHA codes and OSHA violations. And there's these videos of where there's buildings falling apart and saying, "Oh, the OSHA inspector is going to get called." So,
Oh
and
shucks.
oh shucks, that's a really funny thing. But I'm not sure what the acronym stands for, but I think it's very interesting to see how do I say this? How there's so like in some regards we have very specific instructions for how we need to
We could
get these
probably
things
just
done, and in
take
other
out food or
terms we
something. I'm
are completely loose with how we regulate things. So I think it'll be interesting to look at how transparency and just politics and all those things kind of combine to, I think, just make our world a better place. So, Isabella, my question to you is how do you think we can be very specific in the way we like approach live politics, almost anything, just apply to whatever you know. How can we be very specific in getting things done so that we actually get the outcome we desire rather than going off a weird course and like say I want to make a apple pie but you end up with like apple jam.
Well, Kenneth, I mean, I think you're completely right. If we can create building codes, I mean, why can't we build partnership codes for, making progress? But I think the most, like the main ingredient would probably be effort. And because, a lot of people are like, oh, you know what, this, I'll make good money choosing this career. And I'll just be like, oh, okay, I'll just like, learn from that. But I think it's really important making an actual effort to understand the problem and actually trying to solve it. Because if you're just like, oh, maybe I don't like this, I'll just do this, but you're not really innovating any ideas or really understanding it well enough to be like, okay, you know what, maybe this won't work because of this. It's important to be through with the problem and understand just also the roots of it.
So Miss Ashley Viquez, I wanted to ask you on that point of like effort, and you were talking about how you did a lot of education and making sure that these people are education and innovation and design thinking. So how can we teach kids, the new generation, to be disciplined and motivated to be putting in that effort?
I think that the motivation and the discipline comes from finding out what people are passionate about. Uh, Having students pick something that they are really excited to work on and really engaged in. I think that is a great entry point into having them learn the skills and you know start working on their own innovations. To Isabella's point, I think it's really important to make the efforts to understand, to engage with experts, and to have them engage with these things with like a rigor and excitement. So yeah, I think that's the entry point. There's this maxim that says that any work that you choose has to be 80% fun and 20% work. You want to do the work, but you want to be really excited and passionate about it and wake up every day to learn more.
That's really interesting that you talk about 80%. I feel like a lot of people use the 80/20. Like I don't remember the name of it, where it's like 20% of the things that you do is like the most impactful, like when you're working on stuff. So I feel that myself too, where the things that I'm very passionate about, of course, it still feels like work to some extent. Like say going to the gym, it's hard and it's annoying, but like after you're outside of the gym, you feel so good. You have those endorphins running in your head. And my question is, how do we discover those things? How do we discover what we like?
I think it just comes from trying a lot of different things, talking to a lot of different people, and really taking the time to self-reflect to get to know who you are. Um, it's really valuable to fail. It's really valuable to do things and realize you don't like them, and reflecting, asking yourself questions, and then, you know, engaging with the things you do like is super important. And sparking creativity and asking questions is the most important thing you can do.
And reflecting on what we've learned as a planet, uh, we have this United Nations, right, where we're trying to unify all of the nations to achieve certain goals. But in many ways, statistics are showing that the most of these goals are not set to be reached by their deadlines. So I think we should scrap some of that, and I'm looking to move forward in a way that's more productive. I mean, even after World War One, the countries were allied, and that led to World War Two. The nature of that. Uh, I think one of the challenges with the United Nations is that many countries, like it doesn't include all of the countries, and there's a lot of trying to skirt certain UN regulations, and there's still a lot of issues in human rights in some countries. How can we address these? And if and I'd like to turn this over to both of the professionals we have here today. How would you reimagine the United Nations if you could scrap it and start again?
I would say that it is just a reflection of the world that we live on. Is complicated. I know how much you have read about the League of Nations. Are you familiar with the League of Nations?
Yes, after World War One, and
After
uh,
World War One, and that I would probably go more to a model like that. But I think there, in hearing what was being said a minute ago, one of the things that um, I think is important is, we set goals, and it's important to have goals. We might not achieve them in the time frame that we think that are going to be done, but that doesn't make them any less worthwhile in my point of view, because I've always set goals for myself that are probably not achievable, but I'm realistic after a while as to what I can get. And so looking at an organization like the United Nations, right? One of the things we have to ask is, how do we make it work a little better? And my experience, actually, I should have mentioned this. The reason I ended up in Rome, Italy, was because my father was working for the Food and Agriculture Organization. And I'm very familiar with the UN structure and the politics of it, and everything that goes on with it. But I'll tell you this. For example, my father went to the United Nations, to FAO, and started a program with a number of other people, but he was instrumental in doing that, creating germplasm banks or seed banks. And you might have read about this place up in the Svalbard in northern um, Norway, which is an island way in the Arctic, where they're now preserving seeds, because we don't know, what we're losing. We're losing our you know, our biodiversity. And so, the UN My point is the UN has done a lot of good things. There's a lot of politics, but as imperfect as it is, I think is the best vehicle to achieve some of these goals.
So how do we get? So you're saying it's the best we've got. How do we get more countries on board? And something I've always thought about is I want to achieve global peace, but the only way to do that is to assemble all countries in some sort of unified organization, and then to get everyone to drop their guns at the same time. Uh, what do you guys think about this? And how can we get more countries on board with peace initiatives and other UN goals?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? I I don't have any one answer. If I had a magic wand, I would make that happen. But I I think a lot of the problems we like the barriers to cooperation is a lack of understanding of our actual interdependence. How we are sharing a lot of public goods and what one like we need to I understand the UN um like the desires to respect sovereignty, and I think that of course is very important. But I think it's really important also for countries to understand that like we're not alone, we're not isolationist, we don't
Mm.
exist only in our own countries. uh, we are part of something larger, and I mean, that's really what the ideals of the United Nations are all about. Of course, at the end of the day, they are ideals, but I think it's more about the buy-in of that. Like countries need to buy into uh, this idea of a global community.
I think you need to sort of earn, for lack of a better term, the respect and the admiration, and people will come. That's my experience in everything I've done. People don't just come running to you um, because they like you. You have to really uh, put the work on. And so one of the things that I would say is that unfortunately the United Nations is trying to do too much in too many areas. I think you would be far more successful if we just picked up a few things that we want to work on and work on those really hard. Uh, the 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 structure of the UN right now is such that they're trying to address too many things, and they don't really have the resources. So they are actually not doing very well at any of them. And so I think if they just picked a few things to do, maybe we'll make some progress. Very personal opinion.
Jack of all trades, master of none
Yeah.
idea.
You mentioned that, in order for countries to come aboard with the ideas that, the UN has, that they should like gain respect. What do you think, or what are some of the ways that a country or a nation can, get that respect from other places if maybe they are or they aren't on board with the UN?
Well, let me just cite because I'm sort of thinking here uh, on my feet of the amount of territory that Costa Rica has set aside for national parks and how that has been reflected in tremendous ecotourism, which now is creating other problems, but uh, at least it's providing quite a bit of employment and quite a bit of income while still respecting nature. And so you know, there are lots of things like that that even small countries can do, right? And so you look at it, even countries like Finland, for example, that have been leaders in technology. Most people don't really know that, but you look at a company that most of you guys have not heard of called Nokia, that did some of the
Oh,
very
yeah.
innovative stuff on telephones and cellular phones and so on. So I think every country can contribute in different ways. One of the issues that we have is that we put countries in competition with one another for everything, and then there are no winners really.
I think everything that we talked about today, from just empathizing with from like an individual to a cultural level, from talking about how there's problems on different levels, along with gaining your own respect by making sure you follow through with the things that you're doing and attracting talent to you. And I mean talent by saying these countries that have the resources, but they don't want to follow along and say like, some of the policies that we have, and it's more of a forceful way. And I feel that once we're like have those standards in place, more and more countries will be on board to say form a better, quote unquote, better United Nations. And I think that's almost the perfect place to end off this episode. It's the last one of our 12 episode series. So thank you to
Yes.
everyone who's been listening to our Voices of Impact podcast and supporting us. We hope to see you again soon.
Who knows what we'll do? In clean water and sanitation, we talked about doing a blind water test. Or maybe we'll tour the world exploring different cultures. Nothing's set in stone. Leave a comment down below with what you want us to do, because we might change the paradigm here.
I've definitely learned a lot from these past couple episodes. We have amazing, insightful conversations with all of our guests, and I think it's really important that people recognize what our world is facing. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to Voices of Impact.
We hope you enjoyed the Voices of Impact podcast, where we engage in spirited discourse on the world's most pressing issues with the goal to discover and implement solutions.
Our mission is to overcome global and societal conundrums through student unification, accepting our roles as future stewards of planet Earth. Please consider sharing this episode with other humans to enable spirited youth discourse on the planet's most pressing issues.
If you learned something or felt empowered by this episode, tune in Saturdays for more student-led change-making conversations, and be sure to follow, share, and positively rate our show.
Voices of Impact is brought to you by the University of San Diego's Jacobs Institute for Innovation in Education, PPC Profit Pros, and Schoolcast, a Cloudcast media program to empower the voices of young students around the world.